Hi, everyone, and welcome to China's DeepSeek Moment, a webinar series from the Center for China Analysis at Asia Society Policy Institute. I am Lizzie Li, your moderator today. Today's session is titled Behind Beijing's Rare Earth Chokehold, the new flashpoint in US-China trade and tech tensions. This issue has developed quickly. Rare earths have emerged as a critical and often misunderstood flashpoint in the US-China competition. They were specifically mentioned in the recent President Trump and President Xi's telephone call, and China's tightening of export licenses is already ripping through key sectors like autos and defense, as we will discuss later today. So what we're trying to do today is to cut through some of the noise and clarify what's really happening and what's at stake. There are many theories and assumptions out there about how rare earth supply chains work, why China dominates them, and how this dominance is being leveraged. Our goal today is to explore what insights we can reasonably draw from public sources and what the broader strategic implications might be. Joining me to unpack how we got there and where things might be headed are Paul Triolo and Pascal Massat, two CCE honorary fellows. Welcome, and let's jump right in. So, Pascal and Paul, rare earths were a central topic in the Trump-Xi call last week, and also in ongoing trade talks between Vice Premier He Lifeng's team and Treasury Secretary's team currently happening in London. What are your takeaways from the conversation between President Trump and President Xi, and what does this signal about where this is all heading? I'm going to start with Pascal.
Yeah, thanks, Lizzie, and thanks for doing this and having me with you. So I guess my main takeaway is that this issue has emerged as central in that it has changed the nature of US-China strategic competition. We're sort of in a new era, as it were. China had in the past, tinkered with the issue of critical minerals and rare earths, but clearly this has become now something different. And so the urgency with which the two parties needed to talk is as a result of this. And it won't go away. It's here to stay. And I think, we can see it two ways. It raises the stakes. And it also means for me, and this is one of my current takeaways, is that this will continue. It makes the relationship sort of both sides now need to manage it going forward. So there's no sort of pulling away from each other. It sort of makes it clear that this will need to be an ongoing conversation, as it were. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pascal. And Paul, as we saw just today, Chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, Kevin Hassett, mentioned that, China was kind of releasing rare earth export control, but it's going a lot slower than companies believe was optimal. And he specifically mentioned that, once the rare earth mineral issues was resolved, perhaps as part of the ongoing negotiation in London, then both sides would go back to the negotiating table another time on other issues. So how do you interpret that? How do you interpret that in the context of the recent high-level conversations between the U.S. and China?
Great question, Lizzie, and thanks again for having me. And I definitely agree with Pascal that we're in a new era. And I think you have to admit that when it's pretty amazing when President Trump is uttering the words rare earth magnets, and I think that sort of captures the moment here. So my read of the remarks by Kevin Hassett is that on the U.S. side, which appears to have misjudged sort of where China is on some of this stuff, that the goal of this meeting today in London, for example, is very much to sort of trade some agreement on expediting licenses for rare earths, which have been in process for since the April 4th for some of the recent export controls. So I'm looking at this very much as an effort by both sides to sort of back down, at least initially, a bit to leave room for further negotiations, because the rare earth issue has clearly become, sort of overpowered the other trade part of the trade negotiations, because of stoppages at plants in the U.S. For example, Ford shutting down its Explorer SUV plant. I think that really got the attention of the White House and has led to this sort of rushed a trip to London to try to say, okay, let's back off here a bit on both sides, because we don't want to have plants shutting down in both countries because of actions taken by one side or the other. Now, it's tricky because the U.S. Is asking China to expedite these licenses. We can talk more about how the Chinese Ministry of Commerce has put in place a very complicated licensing regime, and some of the delays are likely just related to sort of bureaucratic challenges that any bureaucracy faces in putting in place such a complicated licensing regime. But then I think the U.S. is hoping that the actions it took after Geneva, the so-called, what I have called a escalate to de-escalate strategy, will be sufficient to get us back to some sort of level of equilibrium from which then further negotiations can happen. But it's even getting to there, I think, is going to be complicated because, as we'll see further in our discussion, Beijing now views this issue as creating significant leverage. And has sort of tasted blood, as some have called it, and so getting clarity on what Beijing wants and what Washington will be willing to give beyond these initial efforts to sort of back down from the crisis, if you will, still remains to be seen. But I think we're definitely in a new world, and there's no going back to the world before April 4th or April 2nd.
Fantastic. And before we get further into today's tensions, let's zoom out a little bit. China dominates rare earth processing, maybe not production, but definitely processing. Pascal, can you walk us through how that dominance came to be? What did China do right, so to speak, and why haven't other countries caught up?
Yeah, thanks for this. I think it's really interesting to go back and look at the evolution of China's rare earths, sector. And in some ways, it reverberates. It's sort of a pattern of evolution that we find in other industries and other sectors. And to just start off, I think it's important to remember that the rare earths, the set of metals, rare earths metals, is unique in China because it's one of the only critical groups of critical minerals where China actually dominates production and the midstream segment. So it positioned itself very early as a key producer and moved sort of up the value chain, so to speak, with the decades. And so if we go back, in the very, very early years, we had a phase of very, very rapid expansion, which we recognize in other sectors, right? Really, really fast expansion, very wasteful, a lot of firms, hundreds of firms, so on and so forth, back in the 80s and early 90s. And very rapidly, then the Chinese government implemented a series of efforts to consolidate the industry and to vertically integrate that into sort of industrial ecosystems, magnet manufacturing, so on. So, as we move through the 90s and the 2000s and China enters, the global economy, the Chinese government also tries to control this interface with the global economy, and rare earths flood global markets. And this is where we see the exit of Western firms, including American ones, right, which were in the rare earths industry in the 90s and exited due to price collapses. So 2000s, 2010s, then you have Chinese government efforts to really consolidate the industry, clean up the most polluting firms, the illegal exporters, and so on. And so you have very tight consolidation of the industry, going into the 2010s. And culminating in 2021 with the creation of the China Rare Earths Group, CREG, which really brings control of the sector together. All along there, you have the creation of the midstream and downstream supply chains. So this is where the whole sort of vertical integration becomes important. And then the last thing I would maybe highlight as we move through the 2020s, as it were, the last layer then is that the sector becomes sort of central to China's understanding of national security, and the government only very recently has started using the licensing system, and culminating now in 2025 as really a tool in its interaction and strategic competition with the US. It's a long history, but very interesting and illustrative one when we think about China's development overall. Yeah.
Fantastic. And we'll zoom in on the licensing system and what it means later in our webinar. But Paul, I mean, as we introduce this series, China's DeepSeek moment, we want to focus on sort of underappreciate and underestimate Chinese tech inflection point. And Paul, as you mentioned, China's rare earth chokehold was kind of underestimated by the US policymakers. But how vulnerable is the global supply chain right now, especially when it pertains to US businesses? Is there any short-term workarounds, or are we looking at a 5+ year or 10+ year runway to reduce exposure meaningfully from China?
Great question, Lizzie. And I mean, it's interesting that we're framing the question that way, right? As long as geopolitical conditions are right, then the supply chains are pretty resilient, because even though China has dominated them, in the absence of conflict or U.S. export controls, companies are able to purchase these materials and magnets at a reasonable cost, et cetera. So all of a sudden now we're in a game of trying to determine how to make more resilient supply chains. And as many I'm sure are aware, China attempted to control rare earths in the case of Japan in a geopolitical context in 2010. And that's a good illustration of the difficulty of actually reducing dependence on China, because in the 15 years since 2010, Japan has made some progress, for example, in reducing dependence, but those are really marginal gains. And Chinese automakers are just as at much risk of losing access to rare earth magnets as U.S. companies. They may have a few more alternatives than the U.S., but they still have not made a big dent in China's dominance. And again, the problem here is, as Pascal notes, I mean, this is a 15-year, 20-year process that has seen China and Chinese companies and Chinese industry and Chinese education system produce a ecosystem which has really resulted in this dominance. And so just to throw out a few numbers, in terms of personnel, there's something like 125,000 personnel in China that are working directly on rare earth supply chains. And this ecosystem is fed by something like 35 university programs that are graduating about 2,000 people a year that are going into this pipeline. So this is a serious sort of ecosystem that China has developed here. It's not just about processing and mining overseas, but much of what goes on overseas, but it's about sort of end-to-end so-called mine-to-magnet development that China has pursued here. And these are not just any personnel. I mean, these are people who then go into the industry, are trained on equipment, which in many cases is very dangerous and requires 2 to 3 years of training just to use the equipment, for example. And so this represents a huge investment in personnel, roughly 100 times what the U.S. has. As of two years ago, I believe the U.S. had something like 400 or 500 people working in this. So a huge difference in terms of just the magnitude of effort. And then I don't believe the U.S. has any programs that are focusing on rare earths. I'm sure the U.S. has lots of mining programs, but rare earths are a very specific kind of niche within the mining industry. And so far, there hasn't been a huge effort to overcome that sort of personnel gap. And then across the supply chain, really that 100-time investment is really present across the sort of entire supply chain. Then there's also the IP that's related to specific kinds of production that's required, particularly things like rare earth magnets. magnets, which have been right at the epicenter, if you will, of this problem. All the EV makers in the US require large numbers of rare earth magnets. A typical EV has something like 200 magnets. Not all EVs, or not all rare earth magnets, but a lot of them require rare earth magnets, particularly for the motor to optimize battery life, for example. And China has now something like over 20,000 patents in the area of sort of IP related to rare earths and producing final products such as magnets. So it's mining, processing, but I think probably more important, and that's the toughest part probably for Western companies to overcome in the short term, is that IP related to actually doing the production of magnets and knowing how to use the machines that make the magnets. So, for example, MP Materials, which is a large U.S. rare earth producer, right now is shipping most of its concentrates to China for processing, and then the company only has a small capacity, for example, to manufacture magnets. And guess who makes the machines that are used to manufacture the magnets? Well, most of those are coming from China, and which are also controlled. So it's a whole series of sort of results of long-term investments in all pieces of this ecosystem that has led to this dominance. And then, of course, in the U.S., you have things like permitting for mines, and just the general sort of system that doesn't make it easy for companies to jump into this space. And one last example is that when I talk to people in the rare earth industry, they say, look, to really solve this problem, the government needs to step up with some type of subsidies that are guaranteed for long periods of time, like 10 years. This would require, really making a dent in this would require something like $600 billion in investment over a period of years, working with the private sector to incentivize these types of investment. And that doesn't even account, I think, for the sort of STEM education or the educational part of that, to produce personnel who would work in this industry, right? This is a similar challenge the U.S. faces in onshoring semiconductor manufacturing, is making sure the education system is producing the right people for this. So this is a bigger problem than just, mining rare earths. And you've seen some commentators treat this as as a sort of an easy issue to solve, saying, rare earths aren't really that rare. Well, that's not the problem. The problem is that what's rare is an end-to-end ecosystem that's been developed over 15 years that then also acts to prevent competitors from jumping in, because those companies in that industry have economies of scale and can set prices, et cetera, making it all the more difficult to find alternatives. So this is not a simple problem, and it's really a decade-long problem that can be tackled, but it requires leadership, and probably in the U.S., the establishment, for example, of a whole new agency to really see this through over multiple administrations, because this is not going to be solved by this administration, for example.
Well, thank you so much. It certainly sounds like a challenging long-term problem that requires long-term solution. But Pascal, I'm going to turn to you. If we just focus on the short term, are there reasonable leverages the United States has against China's potential intensifying its rare earth export control? What are realistic in terms of short-term workaround?
So I think I'm going to have to sort of agree with Paul here. There's no solving this issue in the short term. We can certainly take steps in the short term, and advance certain files, but the whole issue is not going to go away. And this is why actually this has made this moment particularly unique in the story, the recent history of U.S.-China competition. The Paul has laid it out very well, right? We can't just understand this issue just on the sort of narrow production side, the mining of minerals. It's an ecosystem issue. There are, given the fact that this can't be solved in the short term, there are nevertheless certain types of decisions that can be made to accelerate movement on the most critical choke points. So I think that in this realm, and this is not only in the United States, but in Canada too, and in Europe and other places, I think that the issue of critical minerals had been noted. It's been at least 5 years that a slew of countries have unveiled critical mineral strategies and so on. And the efforts are, in many instances, spread thin across a whole range of different critical minerals. And I think that if progress can be made, choices, we need to target our efforts, in other words. And so at the most critical choke points, the ones that are hurting the most, and there you see some interesting developments. And I would highlight the fact that this is not something that most countries or any country really can accomplish on their own. So there's a very important bilateral at the very least, but plurilateral most effectively angle to this. And an interesting example would be the recent Japan-France agreement to invest in a rare earths, particularly heavy rare earths processing facility in France. And the model, it's really interesting because the model actually involves the Japanese JOGMEC, Organization for Metals and Energy Security, that invested in a French project to separate and refine rare earths, including, as I mentioned, the heavy rare earths, which are more problematic to process than the light rare earths, which are processed by MP, materials, like Paul mentioned. So this kind of agreement involves Japan then getting a long-term offtake from the French project. So against its 50% investment. And so this is the kind of thinking where you have collaboration on the technology front and the production and especially midstream segment that can actually make a dent, where Japan is hoping to get about 20% of its future demand from that project. This is a sizable portion, but as we've been saying in various different ways, this is not a 5-year thing. So it's probably, a couple decades of planning, and it needs multiple pieces to come together, including various pieces of an industrial policy to come together to truly make a dent in the problem. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Pascal. Pascal, back to your point about the evolution of China's rare earth export controls. How do these latest measures, especially those implemented since 2024, fit into China's broader strategic playbook, especially in the dynamic against U.S. Chip bans, blacklists, and the broader tit-for-tat dynamics with U.S. tech rivalry? Paul, I'm going to turn to you. How does this piece fit into the broader discussion about chip bans, export controls on AI? How will that shape the next round of negotiations?
Wow, yeah, great question, Lizzie. A lot to unpack there. So I've attempted to link, of course, the China's use of rare earths and the methodical process they have used, Beijing has used, working with MOFCOM to put in place this licensing regime, to essentially the initial efforts by the U.S. to weaponize its own choke point technologies, namely semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, which began arguably in 2019 with the NA listing of Huawei, but really started in earnest in October of 2022 with this first, massive export control package that included controls on GPUs and on semiconductor tools across the board. So the origin of these rare earth controls really, I would argue, dates to that October package, when Beijing realized that the U.S. would be attempting to constrain a much broader set of Chinese companies and technologies than just Huawei, for example. So, and it's important to note too that critical minerals and rare earths have a lot of military applications, but I think rare earths fall much more clearly into the military dual use arenas, for example. So Beijing determined that if the U.S. was going to argue that semiconductors could end up in military systems, it would attach increasing national security importance to rare earths and magnets. So, for example, samarium cobalt magnets are widely used in, I believe, virtually all U.S. missile systems. And so, again, if the U.S. was going to argue that a semiconductor could end up in an AI an application that could then be used as for a military application and could make a difference across the Taiwan Strait in the event of a conflict, China can then very plausibly argue that that U.S. missile systems that could be used against China in a Taiwan contingency that would contain Chinese origin samarium cobalt magnets were sort of a no-no. So probably we're gonna have. Even if we get some thawing and some licensing easing around EV manufacturers, for example, as we've already seen happen after Geneva and then after the phone call, it's going to be really tough to get China to be willing to export rare earth magnets to U.S. military and defense industrial end users. And so what's happened is this issue has become very, very much a national security issue. And we saw this as part of this process recently with the establishment of this new entity called the Office of the National Export Control Coordination Mechanism, which has the authority to convene and, quote, make work arrangements for several Chinese ministries responsible for national security. So guess what? This in addition to MOFCOM, this includes the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of State Security, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, the State Administration for Market Regulation, the Ministry of National Resources, the State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission, and the General Administration of Customs. So this issue now, of course, is almost way that. The definition of that office and the mechanism mean that the issue is well beyond sort of just a trade issue or just an issue of determining export controls on sort of civilian products. That this is very much viewed in the Chinese system now as a national security issue and a big deal. And in addition, for example, I've heard talk that China could also implement other things like, as the U.S. has done, sort of an extraterritorial de minimis regulation, for example, to control magnets that are used in other systems that Beijing would seek to have some kind of an export control purview over. For example, advanced UV lithography systems all use neodymium iron boron magnets. This is one of the other magnets that are used, of course, in the EV industry that has been such a big deal in halting U.S. production and production of EVs in other countries. So China could, learning from the U.S. How to do export controls around national security and small yards and high fences and national security and economic security, could choose to extend its for example, its export controls extraterritorially in other areas because of the wide use of these magnets in particular in other industries. And so clearly now, again, getting back to Pascal's original point here, we're in a new world here. The Chinese system has sort of woken up to this choke point issue, and it's become very, very quickly a national security issue over the last two and a half, 3 years. And again, that's not going to go away anytime soon. And part of the problem in holding up some of the licenses, I believe, recently is that this new mechanism is reviewing some of the licensing applications with this view of national security and insisting, of course, that traders and companies identify clearly end users to prevent some of these materials and magnets, for example, from ending up in U.S. defense industrial supply chains. And so that's not going to go away. And that's, those companies that have, like Lockheed Martin and others that have already had trouble getting these products, this I think even predates the April shutdown of global shipments of rare earths, because the Chinese government is now saying, we're not going to ship these materials to defense industrial end users. And that probably won't change. And that's going to be also tricky in terms of the negotiations because they have focused so much on the commercial civilian side and things like EVs. But these materials are widely used throughout the U.S. defense industrial sector, for example. And that's going to be a tricky issue to see how that's handled. But again, I doubt whether we're going to see licenses issued to U.S. end users in the military and industrial space.
Fantastic. Well, Paul, thank you so much. And just following up on the new licensing system you mentioned, there seems to be some conflicting reports about whether licenses are being issued and to whom, at what speed. U.S. officials earlier suggested that it could be a glitch in the system, likely referring to this new, application system, this new licensing system put in place in recent months, or perhaps it's intentional slow rolling. So based on your conversations with, industry sources and experts, what are they actually seeing? How are the licensing process going at this point?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's important to note that after April 4th, it was a global stoppment of shipments. And so that required everybody to come in and apply for an export license to MOFCOM's equivalent, essentially, of the Bureau of Industry and Security. And so what we hear is within the last couple of weeks that there's something like 100,000 applications that have been made here to the MOFCOM office. And that office has doubled its staff from 30 to 60, something like that. But again, the lack of some clear guidance on licensing, even with this new mechanism, and the fact that this is all very new, has really complicated sort of unsorting and unpacking how much of this is sort of bureaucratic challenges and inertia, and how much of this is policy. And we also have to remember, of course, that just after the Geneva Agreement, whatever was agreed to in Geneva was probably a very general sense that MOFCOM and the Chinese government would review this rare earth licensing process. I don't believe that they agreed to just lift the licensing procedure and sort of go back to things as they were before April 4th. But they definitely agreed to consider licenses. But again, right after Geneva, the U.S. issued this guidance on Huawei processors, and this really angered the Chinese members of the Chinese trade team, for example, Li Changgang and others, who saw this as violating the spirit of Geneva. And so we saw this language used repeatedly when the U.S. took additional measures in the export control realm in terms of blocking parts, for example, to COMAC and other on the aviation side, and restricting EDA tools, for example, restricting the U.S. company sales of EDS tools in China, support for those tools. So all of those were characterized by the Chinese government as violating the spirit, not only of Geneva, but of the February 17th call between the two presidents before President Trump was even in office, that had sort of basically said, hey, let's not take measures that worsen the bilateral relationship. And so the Chinese government saw all these actions by the U.S. government as sort of, in contravention of Geneva. And so that muddied the waters then in terms of how much of this licensing delay, for example, is related to the bureaucratic challenges that MOFCOM faces in just processing this number of applications, and how much of it was probably guidance from the Chinese government to go slow on some of these things. Now, I don't believe the Chinese government's intention was to shut down EV factories all over the world. I think that there's definitely some element of just the challenge of the scope of trying to process 100,000 applications. But on the other hand, I think there was a desire on the part of the Chinese government after the U.S. took this, particularly the Huawei processor action, to show a little more toughness and to draw blood, if you will, or to make sure that the U.S. government got the message that that the Chinese government could inflict harm on U.S. companies, and even to the point of shutting down factories. And so I think there's a little bit of both in there. I don't know if it's one or the other. And now I think we've seen licenses being issued to the big three automakers, which are the big one. I think they're talking about 6 months. And so it's still complicated, because what we hear is licenses are being issued, but that doesn't necessarily translate directly, for example, into material moving again and getting on ships. We heard that also some Chinese magnet manufacturers, for example, had shut down production, waiting to get clarity on the whole issue. So starting up the supply chain and starting up shipments and logistics for all this is going to take some time. But it looks like the Chinese government has made a decision, at least initially, to ease up and make sure that licenses are flowing for some of the big name companies, particularly GM and Ford and Stellantis in the U.S., for example. But again, this doesn't mean that things are going back to normal or exactly as they were before April 4th. That's not going to happen, and we are in a new world.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. And finally, turning to you, Pascal, just looking ahead, how do you expect this rare earth issue to evolve in the coming months? Is it a bargaining chip in the short term, or is it part of a longer term shift in China's geo-economic posture against the United States?
Yeah, thank you, Lizzie, for the question. It's I entirely agree with Paul's view here. I think that however different actors on the Chinese side intended this to happen, they have stumbled upon something that clearly is very painful for the US. And so there's no putting this back into the box. So now I think what's interesting is that, if we think for a moment at China's positioning vis-a-vis not only the US, but the rest of the world, I don't think that China's endgame, clearly, as Paul suggests, right, was to cripple the whole world's supply chains. So especially not to undermine trust in China's capacity to deliver on its, exporting industries. Right? This goes completely against what China is trying to accomplish in Europe, for example. So I think that there will be debates in China between those who might prefer to use this and sort of crank up the pressure a little bit on this tool, especially in the context of China-US competition, and those who might argue on the other side that will have second-order effects and damaging impacts on China's relationship with other partners and maybe longer-term objectives in terms of, global trade. Right? China's been trying to position itself as the responsible, player on some of these issues in the face of U.S. tariffs, for example. Well, this sort of levels the playing field, as it were. And so it will be interesting to see the back and forth between those two views developing over the coming months in China. For the Chinese system to be able to wield this tool effectively, it will also have to solve the licensing bottleneck. So it will have to be able to get a handle on how to do this, because obviously it can't be an effective tool if you hurt, a bunch of others that you're not meaning to hurt at the same time. So you're not really signaling properly. So hopefully they'll get a handle on the licensing system. So there's a few ways to see this. I guess on the one hand, you could say this marks the beginning of an escalatory cycle where we've unveiled more ways to hurt one another, as it were. But at the same time, I think that because there is no short-term solution for the American side, it might actually create the need for the two sides to continue to manage this going forward, as opposed to sort of pulling away definitively from one another. And so there is this element, counterintuitively speaking, that renders this file a sort of an existential one. So it means that the two sides will have to continue. It offers maybe some kind of incentive for the management of the strategic competition. We can hope, rather than the first salvo towards further escalation.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much for that insightful take, Pascal, and also to Paul. And thank you to our audience for joining us for this session in our China's DeepSeek Moment webinar. We hope this conversation shed light on the complexities and also the high stakes behind China's rare strategy and its evolving role in U.S.-China trade and tension. Also, a big thank you to our panelists, Paul and Pascal, for sharing your insights with us. And for more analysis, please be sure to follow the Center for China Analysis at Asia Society Policy Institute. I am Liz